Hello, everyone. Today, we delve into a story that explores the delicate and often painful complexities of familial relationships. This narrative contains themes of betrayal and inappropriate behavior, but it is told with sensitivity and care. If you are ready to embark on this journey, please remember that the power of stories lies in their ability to foster empathy and understanding. Let us begin. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second echoing through the quiet house like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. Dami sat at the dining table, her fork hovering over a plate of lukewarm pasta. The food had long since lost its appeal, but she pushed it around anyway, her mind wandering far from the meal. Across from her, Stefan, her husband of 10 years, was engrossed in his laptop. The blue glow of the screen reflected off his glasses, and his fingers moved furiously over the keyboard, filling the room with the rhythmic clatter of typing. "The client wants the designs by Friday," Stefan said, not looking up. His voice was flat, mechanical, as if he were dictating to a colleague rather than speaking to his wife. "If we don't deliver, they'll take the project to another firm. Can you believe the nerve?" Dami nodded absently, her eyes drifting to the window. Outside, the streets of Portsmouth were quiet, the faint sound of waves crashing against the shore drifting in through the open window. The coastal city was beautiful, but its tranquility felt suffocating tonight. She glanced back at Stefan, who was now muttering under his breath about deadlines and incompetent contractors. She wondered if he even noticed she was there. She felt invisible, like a ghost in her own home. It wasn't a new feeling. Stefan had been this way for years, consumed by his work, his ambitions, his endless pursuit of success. At first, she tried to bridge the gap between them, to remind him of the life they'd built together. But over time, she'd stopped trying. It was easier to fade into the background, to become a silent observer in her own life. Her eyes drifted to the dim lights spilling into the hallway. In that room, just a few days ago, something had happened. Something that shattered every boundary between her and Nicholas, Stefan's 22-year-old son from his first marriage. Her stepson. The moment his name crossed her mind, a heavy weight pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She remembered every detail, every touch, every word. It was wrong, so wrong, but she couldn't stop thinking about it. "Dami, are you even listening?" Stefan's voice snapped her back to reality. He slammed his glass down on the table, the sound sharp and jarring. She flinched, forcing a smile as she turned to him. "Yes, Stefan," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. But she wasn't hearing a thing. The only sound she could hear was the pounding of her own heart, echoing in her ears like a drum. Stefan sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "This project is going to kill me," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "If I don't get these designs finalized by tomorrow, we're screwed." Dami nodded again, her mind drifting back to Nicholas. She could still feel the warmth of his hand on her back, the way his fingers had lingered just a little too long. She could still hear his voice, low and teasing, as he'd offered to help her with the sunscreen. "I can help you if you want." The memory sent a shiver down her spine, a mix of guilt and something else, something she didn't want to name. "Dami," Stefan said again, his tone sharper this time. "I need you to focus. This is important." She forced herself to look at him to meet his gaze. "Of course, Stefan," she said, her voice hollow. "I understand." But the truth was, she didn't understand. She didn't care about his projects, his deadlines, his clients. The only thing she cared about was the ache in her chest, the loneliness that had become her constant companion. She glanced at the other end of the table, where Emma, their 13-year-old daughter, sat. The girl was half asleep, her eyelids heavy as she pushed her food around her plate. "Come on, sweetheart," Dami said softly, standing up. "Let's get you to bed." Emma mumbled a quick goodnight to her dad before standing up, her small hand slipping into Dami's. They walked down the hallway together, the sound of Stefan's typing fading behind them. Dami tucked Emma into bed, brushing her hair back gently as the girl drifted off to sleep. For a moment, she lingered, watching her daughter's peaceful face. Emma was innocent, blissfully unaware of the tension in the house, of the storm that was brewing just beneath the surface. Soon as Dami stepped back into the hallway, the weight in her chest returned. She paused outside Nicholas's door, her hand hovering over the knob. She could hear faint music playing inside, the low thrum of a bass line that matched the rhythm of her heartbeat. For a moment, she considered knocking, but she quickly shook the thought away. Instead, she made her way to her own bedroom, shutting the door behind her with a soft click. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon outside. Dami stood in front of the mirror, catching her reflection in the glass. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Her eyes were shadowed, her face pale and drawn. She looked tired, worn down by years of neglect and loneliness. Her thoughts drifted back to Nicholas. He was young, just 22, but he carried himself with a confidence that was almost intimidating. He had his father's sharp features, but there was a warmth in his eyes that Stefan had long since lost. Dami had always been careful around him, keeping her distance, but lately, that distance had started to blur. Few nights ago, after dinner, Nicholas had stayed behind to help her clean up. They'd worked in silence, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. At one point, their hands had brushed as they reached for the same dish, and Dami had felt a jolt of electricity shoot through her. She'd pulled away quickly, but the moment had lingered, replaying in her mind over and over. Now, as she stood in the dark, she could still feel the ghost of his touch. She closed her eyes, trying to push the memory away, but it was no use. The more she tried to ignore it, the stronger it became. Something was about to change. She could feel it. A storm was brewing in this house, and every cell in her body knew it. When that storm hit, nothing would ever be the same. Dami stood in the dimly lit bedroom, her reflection in the mirror staring back at her like a stranger. The moonlight streaming through the window cast long shadows across the room, making everything feel surreal, like she was trapped in a dream she couldn't wake up from. She reached up and touched her face, her fingers tracing the lines of exhaustion etched into her skin. When had she last felt truly alive? When had she last felt seen? The sound of Stefan's voice drifted in from the living room, pulling her back to reality. He was on the phone now, his tone sharp and impatient as he argued with someone from his firm. Dami sighed, turning away from the mirror. She didn't need to hear the conversation to know what it was about. Another client, another deadline, another crisis that only Stefan could solve. It was always the same. She walked over to the bed and sat down, her fingers brushing against the cool sheets. The room felt too big, too empty, even with Stefan just a few feet away. They hadn't shared a real conversation in months, let alone any kind of intimacy. The distance between them had grown so wide that it felt impossible to bridge. Dami had tried in the beginning. She'd suggested date nights, weekend getaways, even couples counseling. But Stefan always had an excuse. Work is crazy right now, he'd say. Maybe next month. Next month never came. Her thoughts drifted back to Nicholas. He'd been living with them for almost a year now, ever since he'd moved to Portsmouth to start an internship at a local tech company. At first, Dami had been wary of having him in the house. She'd never been close to Stefan's son. Their interactions had always been polite but distant. But over time something had shifted. Nicholas had a way of filling the silence, of making her feel like she wasn't just a shadow in her own home. She remembered the first time she'd really noticed him. It had been a rainy afternoon, and she'd been sitting in the living room, staring out the window as the rain poured down. Nicholas had walked in, his hair damp from the storm, and sat down across from her. They'd talked for hours, about his job, her art, even Stefan's obsession with work. For the first time in years, Dami had felt like someone was actually listening to her. Since then, their conversations had become more frequent, more intimate. Nicholas had a way of looking at her that made her feel seen, like she was more than just Stefan's wife or Emma's mother. It was intoxicating but also terrifying. Dami knew she was playing with fire, but she couldn't help herself. The loneliness had become too much to bear. The sound of Stefan's voice grew louder, pulling her out of her thoughts. She stood up and walked over to the door, pressing her ear against the wood. He was pacing now, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor. "I don't care what it takes," he was saying. "Just get it done. I'm not losing this client." Dami closed her eyes, leaning her forehead against the door. She wanted to scream, to throw something, to make him see how much she was hurting. But she didn't. Instead, she took a deep breath and stepped back, her hands trembling at her sides. She glanced at the clock on the nightstand. It was almost midnight. Stefan would be up for hours, lost in his work, and Dami knew she wouldn't be able to sleep. She grabbed her robe and slipped it on, then quietly opened the door and stepped out into the hallway. The house was dark, the only light coming from the living room where Stefan was still on the phone. Dami tiptoed past, careful not to make a sound. She didn't want to talk to him, didn't want to hear another word about his work. She just wanted to be alone. But as she passed Nicholas's door, she hesitated. The faint sound of music was still playing inside, and she could see a sliver of light spilling out from under the door. Her heart raced as she stood there, her hand hovering over the knob. She told herself to keep walking, to go downstairs and make a cup of tea, to do anything but what she was about to do. But she couldn't help herself. She knocked softly, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, there was silence. Then the music stopped, and she heard footsteps approaching the door. It opened a crack, and Nicholas peered out, his hair messy and his shirt rumpled like he'd just woken up. "Dammy," he said, his voice low and groggy. "Is everything okay?" She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she just stood there, staring at him, her heart pounding in her chest. Nicholas frowned, stepping closer. "Dammy, what's wrong?" She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. I don't know," she whispered. I needed to see you." Nicholas's expression softened, and he reached out, his hand brushing against her arm. The touch sent a shiver down her spine, and for a moment, she forgot how to breathe. "Come in," he said quietly, stepping aside to let her in. Dammy hesitated, glancing back down the hallway. Stefan's voice was still echoing from the living room, but he sounded far away, like he was in another world. She took a deep breath and stepped inside, the door closing softly behind her. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a small lamp on the desk. Nicholas's bed was unmade, the sheets tangled and messy, and the air smelled faintly of his cologne. Dammy stood in the middle of the room, her arms wrapped around herself, feeling suddenly self-conscious. Nicholas walked over to her, his eyes searching hers. "Talk to me," he said softly. "What's going on?" Dammy shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I don't know," she said, her voice breaking. I feel so alone." Nicholas didn't say anything. Instead, he reached out and pulled her into a hug, his arms wrapping around her tightly. Dammy buried her face in his chest, her body trembling as she finally let herself cry. For the first time in years, she felt like someone was holding her together, like she wasn't just a ghost in her own life. But even as she clung to him, a part of her knew this was dangerous. The line between them was blurring, and she wasn't sure she could stop it. The storm was coming, and when it hit, nothing would ever be the same. The sun was high in the sky, its golden rays reflecting off the waves as they crashed against the shore. The beach was nearly empty, save for a few scattered families and couples enjoying the warm afternoon. Dammy spread out a towel on the sand, the heat prickling her skin as she sat down. She pulled a bottle of sunscreen from her bag, her fingers trembling slightly as she unscrewed the cap. Nicholas was a few feet away, his shirt already off and draped over his shoulder. His tanned skin glistened in the sunlight, the muscles in his back and arms flexing as he stretched. Dammy couldn't help but notice how confident he seemed, how at ease in his own body. It was a stark contrast to how she felt, awkward, self-conscious, and painfully aware of every movement he made. "You should try to relax, Dammy," Nicholas said, glancing over his shoulder with a sly grin. "Isn't this supposed to feel like a mini vacation?" She forced a smile, though her heart was racing. "Relaxing in the sun isn't exactly my thing," she replied, her voice tinged with sarcasm. She shook the bottle of sunscreen, the liquid sloshing inside. "I burn too easily." Nicholas raised an eyebrow, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before he turned back to the ocean. "Suit yourself," he said, his tone light but with an edge that made her stomach twist. Dammy hesitated, her fingers tightening around the bottle. She needed to apply the sunscreen to her back, but Stefan wasn't there to help. She glanced at Nicholas, who was now lying on his stomach. His face turned away from her. For a moment, she considered asking him, but the thought made her cheeks flush. She shook her head, trying to push the idea away, but the sun was already starting to sting her skin. Finally, with a reluctant sigh, she turned to him. "Nicholas," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He lifted his head, his eyes meeting hers. "Yeah." She held up the bottle, her hand trembling slightly. "Could you help me with this?" "Just my back." For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then a slow smile spread across his face, and he sat up, brushing the sand off his hands. "Sure," he said, his voice calm but with a spark in his eyes that made her heart race. Dammy handed him the bottle, her fingers brushing against his for a split second. She quickly turned around, pulling her hair over one shoulder to expose her back. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears as she waited, the silence between them heavy with unspoken tension. Then she felt his hands on her skin, warm and firm as he began to spread the sunscreen. His touch was gentle but deliberate, his fingers moving in slow, steady strokes. Dami closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing, but it was impossible. Every movement of his hands sent a shiver through her, a mix of guilt and something else, something she didn't want to name. "You're really tense," Nicholas said, his voice low and close to her ear. "You need to relax." Dami swallowed hard, her hands gripping the edge of the towel. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice wavered. Nicholas didn't respond, but his hands moved lower, his fingers brushing against the edge of her swimsuit. Dami's breath hitched, and she instinctively pulled away, her heart racing. "Nicholas, that's enough," she said, her voice trembling. He leaned back, his hands raised in mock surrender. All right, he said, his tone far too casual. "Just making sure you're protected." Dami quickly wrapped a towel around her shoulders, her face burning. She could feel his eyes on her, but she didn't dare look at him. The air between them was thick with tension, and she didn't trust herself to speak. For a while they sat in silence, the sound of the waves filling the space between them. Dami kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, trying to calm her racing thoughts. But every time she glanced at Nicholas out of the corner of her eye, she felt that same pull, that same dangerous attraction. Finally, Nicholas broke the silence. "Dami," he said, his voice soft but loaded with meaning. She turned to him, her heart pounding. Yes. He was closer than she'd realized, his face just inches from hers. His eyes searched hers, and for a moment, she thought he might kiss her. But instead, he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "You've got sensitive skin, huh?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You really should be more careful." Dami's breath caught in her throat, and she quickly looked away, her face burning. I know," she stammered, her voice barely audible. Nicholas didn't say anything else, but his gaze never left her. Dami could feel the weight of it, the intensity of his stare. She knew she should get up, should walk away, but she couldn't bring herself to move. The tension between them was too strong, too intoxicating. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Nicholas leaned back, breaking the spell. "We should probably head back soon," he said, his tone casual, as if nothing had happened. Dami nodded, though her mind was still reeling. She stood up, her legs shaky, and began to gather their things. As they walked back to the car, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them, something irreversible. The drive home was quiet, the tension in the car almost palpable. Dami kept her eyes fixed on the road, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. She could feel Nicholas's gaze on her, but she didn't dare look at him. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Guilt, desire, fear, and she didn't know how to make sense of any of it. When they finally pulled into the driveway, Dami turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, her heart still racing. She could feel Nicholas's eyes on her, but she didn't turn to look at him. Instead, she took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, the cool evening air doing little to calm the storm inside her. As they walked into the house, Dami couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The line between them had blurred, and she wasn't sure she could ever go back. The drive back from the beach was quiet, the hum of the car's engine the only sound filling the space between them. Dami kept her eyes fixed on the road, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She could feel Nicholas's gaze on her, heavy and unrelenting, but she didn't dare look at him. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Guilt, desire, fear, and she didn't know how to make sense of any of it. The memory of his hands on her skin lingered, sending shivers down her spine every time she thought about it. She could still feel the warmth of his touch, the way his fingers had moved so deliberately, so intimately. It had been innocent, hadn't it? Just helping her with sunscreen. But the way he'd looked at her afterward, the way his voice had dropped to a whisper, it had felt like something more. Something dangerous. Nicholas shifted in his seat, his arm resting on the windowsill as he stared out at the passing scenery. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw and the faint stubble along his chin. Dami glanced at him out of the corner of her eye, her heart skipping a beat when she noticed the small smirk playing on his lips. He looked so much like Stefan, and yet so different. There was a warmth in his eyes, a vulnerability that Stefan had long since buried under layers of ambition and indifference. "You're quiet," Nicholas said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a teasing quality that made Dami's stomach twist. Just tired, she replied quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't entirely a lie. The emotional weight of the day had left her drained, but it was more than that. She felt raw or exposed, as if Nicholas had peeled back a layer of her carefully constructed facade and seen something she wasn't ready to show. Nicholas didn't respond, but she could feel his eyes on her again, studying her in that way he had, like he could see straight through her. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her heart pounding in her chest. The air in the car felt thick, suffocating, and she rolled down the window, hoping the cool breeze would clear her head. When they finally pulled into the driveway, Dami turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, her hands still gripping the wheel. She could feel Nicholas's gaze on her, but she didn't turn to look at him. Instead, she took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, the cool evening air doing little to calm the storm inside her. Nicholas followed her into the house, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. Dami set her bag down by the door and turned to face him, her heart racing. He was standing close, too close, his presence filling the space between them with an electric energy that made it hard to breathe. "Dami," he said softly, his voice low and intimate. "Are you okay?" She nodded, though her throat felt tight. Her words caught somewhere between her chest and her lips. "I'm fine," she managed to say, her voice barely audible. Nicholas took a step closer, his eyes searching hers. "You don't seem fine," he said, his tone gentle but probing. "Talk to me." Dami shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. She didn't know how to explain what she was feeling, how to put into words the storm of emotions raging inside her. I don't know," she whispered, her voice breaking. I feel so alone." Nicholas didn't say anything. Instead, he reached out and pulled her into a hug, his arms wrapping around her tightly. Dami buried her face in his chest, her body trembling as she finally let herself cry. For the first time in years, she felt like someone was holding her together, like she wasn't just a ghost in her own life. But even as she clung to him, a part of her knew this was dangerous. The line between them was blurring, and she wasn't sure she could stop it. The storm was coming, and when it hit, nothing would ever be the same. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. Dami stood in the kitchen, her hands gripping the edge of the counter as she tried to steady her breathing. The memory of Nicholas's arms around her, the warmth of his body against hers, played on a loop in her mind. She could still feel the weight of his gaze, the way his eyes had searched hers, as if he could see every secret she'd ever tried to hide. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was late, past midnight, and Stefan was still in his office, lost in his work. Emma was asleep upstairs, her soft snores drifting down the hallway. Dami knew she should go to bed, but sleep felt impossible. Her mind was racing, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. She poured herself a glass of water, her hands trembling as she lifted it to her lips. The cool liquid did little to calm the storm inside her. She set the glass down and leaned against the counter, closing her eyes. She needed to think, to make sense of what was happening, but her thoughts were a tangled mess. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her freeze. She turned her head, her breath catching in her throat as Nicholas appeared in the doorway. He was wearing a loose t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair messy like he'd just woken up. His eyes were dark and tense, and they locked onto hers with an intensity that made her stomach twist. "Dami," he said softly, his voice low and rough. "What are you doing up?" She swallowed hard, her heart racing. "I couldn't sleep," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Nicholas stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. The kitchen felt smaller with him in it, the air thick with tension. Dami's pulse quickened as he approached, her mind screaming at her to step back, to put distance between them. But she couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, her body betraying her. "You've been quiet all evening," Nicholas said, his voice gentle but probing. "Is something wrong?" Dami shook her head, though her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know," she whispered. I feel so lost." Nicholas reached out, his hand brushing against her arm. The touch sent a shiver through her, and she instinctively leaned into it, craving the warmth of his skin against hers. "Talk to me," he said, his voice soft but insistent. "You don't have to carry this alone." Dami looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. His eyes were so full of understanding, so full of something she couldn't name. For a moment, she thought she might break, might let all the pain and loneliness spill out. But then she remembered Stefan, Emma, the life she'd built, the life she was risking. "I can't," she said, her voice trembling. I shouldn't. Nicholas didn't pull away. Instead, he stepped closer, his hand moving to her cheek. His touch was gentle, almost reverent, and it made her breath catch in her throat. Dammy, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to pretend with me. I see you. I see how much you're hurting. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she closed her eyes, trying to block out the intensity of his gaze. But it was no use. His presence was overwhelming, intoxicating, and she felt herself being pulled toward him, like a moth to a flame. Nicholas, she whispered, her voice breaking. This is wrong. He didn't respond, but his hand moved to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair. Dammy's breath hitched as he leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. She could feel the warmth of his breath on her skin, the rapid beat of his heart matching her own. I don't care, he said, his voice low and raw. I don't care if it's wrong. I just know I can't keep pretending I don't feel this. Dammy's mind was screaming at her to stop, to pull away, but her body had other ideas. She reached up, her hands gripping the front of his shirt as she pulled him closer. Their lips met in a kiss that was desperate, hungry, filled with all the emotions they'd been holding back. It was wrong, so wrong, but in that moment, it felt like the only thing that made sense. The kiss deepened, their bodies pressing together as the world around them faded away. Dammy's hands moved to his shoulders, her fingers digging into his skin as she clung to him. Nicholas's arms wrapped around her, pulling her closer, as if he could erase the distance between them. But then, a sound broke through the haze, a creak from the hallway, the soft shuffle of footsteps. Dammy froze, her heart pounding in her chest as she pulled away, her eyes wide with panic. Nicholas stared at her, his chest rising and falling rapidly, his expression a mix of desire and guilt. Dammy, he whispered, his voice rough. She shook her head, cutting him off. We can't, she said, her voice trembling. This can't happen. Nicholas didn't argue, but the look in his eyes said everything. He stepped back, running a hand through his hair as he tried to steady his breathing. Dammy turned away, her hands shaking as she gripped the edge of the counter. The weight of what they'd just done, what they'd almost done, settled over her like a heavy blanket. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and Dammy's heart raced as she realized someone was coming. She glanced at Nicholas, her eyes wide with fear. He nodded, understanding, and quickly stepped back, putting distance between them. A moment later, Stefan appeared in the doorway, his glasses perched on his nose and a stack of papers in his hand. He looked tired, his face drawn and pale, but he didn't seem to notice the tension in the room. Dammy, he said, his voice groggy. What are you doing up? She forced a smile, though her heart was still racing. Just getting some water, she replied, her voice shaky. I couldn't sleep. Stefan nodded, his eyes barely focusing on her. Okay, he said, his tone distracted. Don't stay up too late. He turned and walked back down the hallway, his footsteps fading as he disappeared into his office. Dammy let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, her legs trembling beneath her. Nicholas was still standing there, his eyes locked on hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then finally he took a step back, his expression unreadable. Good night, Dammy, he said softly, his voice filled with something she couldn't quite place. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the kitchen, her mind racing and her heart aching. The storm was here, and there was no turning back. The days that followed were a blur. Dammy moved through the house like a ghost, her mind replaying the kiss with Nicholas over and over. The guilt was a constant weight on her chest, but so was the ache of longing, a longing for something she couldn't name, something she wasn't sure she deserved. Stefan, oblivious as ever, continued to bury himself in his work. He barely noticed her silence, her distance, the way she flinched whenever he touched her. Dammy wanted to feel angry, to resent him for his neglect, but all she felt was sadness. Sadness for the life they'd lost, for the love that had faded into routine. Nicholas, on the other hand, was impossible to ignore. He was everywhere. In the kitchen making coffee, in the living room reading, in the hallway brushing past her with a look that made her heart race. They didn't speak about what had happened, but the tension between them was palpable, a silent acknowledgement of the line they'd crossed. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Dammy found herself standing on the porch, staring out at the ocean. The waves crashed against the shore, their rhythm steady and soothing. She wrapped her arms around herself, the cool breeze tugging at her hair. You've been quiet lately. She turned, her heart skipping a beat as Nicholas stepped onto the porch. He was wearing a hoodie, his hands shoved into the pockets, his expression unreadable. Dami forced a smile, though her chest felt tight. "Just thinking," she said softly. Nicholas nodded, leaning against the railing beside her. For a moment, they stood in silence, the sound of the waves filling the space between them. Then finally he spoke. "Dami," he said, his voice low and hesitant. "About what happened. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have." "Don't," she interrupted, her voice trembling. "Don't apologize. It wasn't just you." Nicholas looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "Then what do we do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where do we go from here?" Dami closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. She didn't know the answer. All she knew was that she couldn't keep living like this, caught between the life she had and the life she wanted. "I need to talk to Stefan," she said finally, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "I need to be honest with him. And with myself." Nicholas nodded, though his expression was pained. "I understand," he said softly. I want you to be happy, Dami. You deserve that." She looked at him, her heart aching at the sincerity in his voice. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me. For making me feel like I matter." Nicholas reached out, his hand brushing against hers for a brief moment before he pulled away. "You'll always matter to me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "No matter what happens." Dami nodded, tears streaming down her face. She watched as he turned and walked back into the house, his figure disappearing into the shadows. For a moment, she felt the urge to call out to him, to tell him to stay. But she didn't. Instead, she took a deep breath and turned back to the ocean, the waves crashing against the shore like a reminder of the strength she needed to find. Later that night, she sat across from Stefan at the dining table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He looked up from his laptop, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Dami," he said, his voice tinged with concern. "Is everything okay?" She took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "No," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "No, Stefan, it's not." For the first time in years, Stefan put his laptop aside and gave her his full attention. "What's wrong?" he asked, his tone gentle but wary. Dami looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "I feel invisible," she said, her voice breaking. "I feel like I've been invisible to you for years. And I can't do it anymore, Stefan. I can't keep pretending that everything's okay when it's not." Stefan stared at her, his expression a mix of shock and guilt. "Dami, I didn't realize," he said, his voice faltering. "I've been so caught up in work, I didn't see how much you were hurting." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know," she said softly. "And I'm not blaming you. But I need more than this. I need to feel like I matter to you, like I'm more than just an afterthought." Stefan reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "You do matter to me," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I've been a fool, Dami. I've taken you for granted, and I'm so sorry." Dami looked at him, her heart aching at the sincerity in his eyes. For the first time in years, she felt like he was truly seeing her. "I need time," she said softly. "Time to figure out what I want, what I need. And I need you to be honest with me, Stefan. Can you do that?" He nodded, his grip on her hand tightening. "I can," he said, his voice steady. "I'll do whatever it takes, Dami. I love you." She smiled through her tears, a sense of peace settling over her. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. And for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. She walked upstairs to check on Emma. She paused outside Nicholas's door. She didn't knock, didn't say a word. But she knew he was there, just as she knew that their connection, however fleeting, had changed her in ways she was still trying to understand. The storm had passed, and in its wake, there was calm. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for Dami, that was enough. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more tales of love, passion, and adventure.